All right, it is 3:01 p.m. And we're here, and I think we should start promptly. I want to begin by thanking our panelists and our audience members for being with us here today for what I think is a really important event, bringing together medieval studies and disability theory into conversation. And I also want to thank my co-convener for this webinar today, Dr. Nahir Otaño-Gracia. We want to preface today's discussion by mentioning that our panelists are, as they also have pointed out, are a light. In organizing the webinar, I sought scholars of color working on disability, as well as scholars who work on disability from a perspective of intersection with race and ethnicity in the Middle Ages. Some of these scholars have left the academy, others are no longer working in the area of disability, and others still were unwilling to attend or work with the Medieval Academy because of past problems. We probably also missed people we should have asked. We recognize this as a problem and as a systemic failure. We recognize the need to try harder in the future to assemble a panel of scholars that is more inclusive in terms of approaches and more representative of global society, despite the systemic issues of access in higher education. And we hope that this conversation and this panel are first steps in branching out to be more intersectional, sectional, and more equitable. Dr. Otaño-Gracia and I extend our profound thanks to Joseph Ackley of Wesleyan University, whose leadership in the past year has been thoughtful and careful and engaged and fantastic. We also welcome Rachel Voss, who joined us immediately after the 2023 conference. She is, hi Rachel, I know you're on this call. She is completing her dissertation on neurological and phenomenological relationships between the body and personal adornment in early medieval England at the University of Delaware. And at this point, I'll hand over to Dr. Otaño-Gracia, Assistant Professor of English at the University of New Mexico, for introductions.
Thank you, Heide, for capturing our thoughts so precisely. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce the speakers, and then I will also post additional information about the webinar on the chat. So first, Richard H. Godden is an assistant professor of English at Louisiana State University. He works primarily on medieval romance, Chaucer, and representations of disability and monstrosity in the Middle Ages. He is completing a book manuscript titled Material Subjects: An Ecology of Prostheses in Medieval Literature and Culture. I can't wait to read it. He is co-editor of the collection Monstrosity, Disability, and the Posthuman in the Medieval and Early Modern World, and he's also co-editor of the open access companion to the Canterbury Tales. He will speak today on Cripping Langland's Will. Leah Parker is an assistant professor of English and English undergraduate coordinator at the University of Southern Mississippi. Parker researches embodied difference and eschatology in medieval England, and is completing a book manuscript on disability and salvation in Old English literature. Another one I need to read. Her talk today is on Eschatologies of Disability, Crip Eschatologies. Our final speaker is Tory V. Pearman, professor of English at Miami University. She researches representations of gender and disability in medieval literature and culture, and is author of Women and Disability in Medieval Literature, Palgrave 2010, and Disability and Knighthood in Mallory's Mordarthur, Routledge 2019. She is co-editor of the Cultural History of Disability in the Middle Ages, Bloomsbury 2022. She will speak today on Cripping time in Chaucer's Bard on Earth's Tale. We will hold questions until the end, at which point participants should feel free to raise hands or put questions in the chat. I will be moderating the Q&A. So thank you. And with that, I leave it to the speakers.
All right, I presume I'm starting then.
Yes, in order of description.
And if someone could drop the handout for me. All right, thank you to the organizers for inviting me here today. So my paper is titled Cripping Langland's Will. To make a pronouncement that I'm sure will surprise very few people familiar with the poem, Piers Plowman has vexed and haunted me ever since the first time that I read it. My first concerns involved naming and anonymity and the unknowability of the subject that produced this poem. Recently, however, I have been roaming in my own remembrance of the text, and I keep revisiting one specific scene. Will being cross-examined by reason and conscience in his attempt to justify his inability or unwillingness to labor with his hands. Echoing the parable of the unjust steward, Will states in what's known as the C5 Apology that he is, and this is number 1 on the handout from it, that he is to awake to work with sickle or with sitha, and to long leave me though to stupa to work as a workman any while to Durham. Because of his inability, he labors with his hands after a different fashion, which is to say the making of the poem. The C5 interlude is often seen as autobiographical, and Derek Pearsall describes it as Will's apologia pro vita sua. I'm certainly not the first to be fascinated and perplexed by this scene, especially given its provocative details of Will being clothed like a lawler and the ways in which it speaks to the statute of laborers, which work to distinguish who was able-bodied and could work from those who were incapable and could join the ranks of the deserving poor. It's here, in this moment of interrogation and attempted self-justification, that I somewhat surprisingly find myself identifying most with the elusive character of Langland's Will. This leads me to ask the following questions. Can we read Will as a disabled figure? If we do, how does that inform and affect our understanding of the poem's social and salvific visions? While the C text of Piers Plowman expands on some of the severe and searching identifications of who is justifiably disabled, I would suggest that it does so while also positing a disabled subject. In this paper, I argue that Will occupies what David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder describe in their Biopolitics of Disability as an anti-normative position, one that highlights the tension between normative frameworks and individual experience, between disability as something determined, or perhaps overdetermined, by social, religious, and economic desires on one hand, and disability as a site for transformative potentialities, non-normative alternative embodiments on the other. Now, at the risk of anachronism and presentism, I just have to admit that Will's interrogation by reason feels all too familiar. Is Will not asking for accommodation? In response, reason is not only asking Will, are you disabled? He is asking, are you disabled enough? Will's declaration that he is too long, that is, too tall to swing the scythe and then stoop down in the field, gets readily dismissed by reason, who instead asks, and this is quotation number 2, or thou art broke, so maybe in body or in member, or maimed through some mishap, whereby thou might be excused. Reason is looking for what would seem like more legitimate justifications. Under the pressure of such probing, we can see the tension between disability as it is lived and experienced and disability as it is imposed, allowed for under regimes of normalcy and of economics. For those who haven't met me yet, excuse me, you might not be able to tell over Zoom that I am a wheelchair user. And as many recognize, the wheelchair is often a universal signifier for disability. This is not an unproblematic issue, but that is a subject for another talk. And yet, despite the legibility of my status, I have had to schedule doctor's appointments and provide documentation to justify to my various employers that I am indeed disabled. I bring this up because if there are so many institutional and legal hurdles for someone who ought to be a clear-cut case of disability, where does that leave someone whose own case is perhaps not so legible? Am I disabled enough, for example, to justify continuing to receive certain accommodations? Is Will disabled enough to labor in the manner of his own choosing? The question of whether we can consider Will disabled is not without its difficulties. As many have pointed out, there is no direct corollary in the languages of medieval Europe to the word disability, and in the modern sense, the term itself is also contested and continuously redefined. Further, disability conjures diagnosis, and it can be difficult, often unproductive, and ill-advised to diagnose a literary character, even if there are autobiographical shadings. And yet, despite such apprehensions, it can be frustratingly simple to identify disability. In our current moment, disability is often construed, at least by institutions, as the inability to labor sufficiently according to the demands of capital. For a similar distinction in the Middle Ages, we only need to look to the Statute of Laborers in 1388. As Anne Middleton and others have demonstrated, Will's interrogation by reason and conscience follows the contours of the statute, which provides prescriptions for who can avoid manual labor, and also polices the movements and activities of those deemed sufficiently incapable of work. This secular effort to distinguish the deserving poor from those who feign their impairments or otherwise deceive others becomes in the poem further entwined with moral and theological frameworks. Now, from the perspective of critical disability studies, we might ask, who gets to separate the actually impaired from the fakers? And what does their criteria reveal about disabled and non-disabled alike? More importantly here, who gets to determine when one is disabled enough? Within the logic of this text, of course, Truth or God or Piers the Plowman gets to decide this. For instance, during the plowing of the half-acre in Passus 8 of the sea text, several would-be laborers make an effort to avoid work. And I put a long quote from this on the handout. This is number 3, but I'm just going to summarize and quote a few pieces. These scoundrels pretend to be blind, or they deftly arrange their limbs so as to seem broken or crooked. Most interestingly, this group claims that, quote, we may neither swinke nor sweate, such sickness us aileth, ne have none limbs to labor with. This last phrase of limbs to labor with repeats a few times throughout the sea text, including from Will as he justifies himself. I will return to that echo in just a moment. In response, Piers rails at them as wasters and beguilers, finally offering this exception. But if he be blind or broke-legged or bolted with iron, such poor, quod Peres, shall part with my goods, both of my corn and of my cloth, to keep him from default. If you are truly blind or maimed or deformed, he says, then you will still receive an appropriate amount of food and cloth for sustenance. As readers, we are invited to identify with not only Will's wanderings and failings, but we are also invited to share in the judgments of figures like Piers or Truth, acknowledging their validity and moral rectitude. And so during the plowing of the half-acre, we see the blatant, egregious deception of those who don't wish to work, and yet this shortly precedes Piers's own decision to cease of his sowing and to lead a different kind of life. Certainly, Piers's reasoning is starkly different from that of the deceivers, but both he and Will represent limit or edge cases that complicate the normative certitudes expressed elsewhere in the text. And although I am arguing that it can be productive to read Will as a disabled subject, his own presentation of his case is not without complication. Before he declares that he is physically unable or ill-suited to work the fields, he describes himself quite differently. The C5 apology opens in this way, and this is quote number 4. Thus he awaked, quote God, when he wandered in Cornhill. Kit and he in a coat, clothed as a lawler, and little let be leaveth me for Sotha, among lawlers of London and lewd ermits, for he made of them men as reason me taught. For as he came by conscience with reason he met, in a hot harvest when he had mean hail, in limbs to labor with and loved welfare, and no day to do but to drink and to sleep. Sounds a bit like May vacation to me. These lines are a bit startling because, it would seem, Will declares himself to be in good health. During that hot harvest, he had both his health and limbs with which to labor. Yet only a few lines later, he will present a different evaluation of his physical ability. As I noted above, the phrase limes to labor with appears a few times throughout the sea text as a description of the deserving poor who lack limbs that are good to work with, but also of the wasters and deceivers who simply claim this to be the case. For a text so concerned with the potential for others to feign disability, it is difficult to escape the possibility that Will might be lying or over-rationalizing to reason. But another question is, if he has limbs to labor with, what sort of labor might he be doing? Just before his pronouncement of health, he mentions the verses he wrote about lollers and others, using the word mada or maid, a term familiar to Middle English literature to describe the craft of writing and poetry, of making and fashioning things with words. Under further interrogation by reason, Will relates how his father and his friends sent him to school to labor with reading and writing to earn his living by the employments those skills enable. He then nearly duplicates an earlier line, writing, and this is quote 5, "The lomas that ye labor with in leaflet deserva is paternoster and me primer, placebo and derija." Aided by the alliteration of the line, limes or limbs gets replaced with lomas or tools. Rather than earning his living with his limbs, his arms and legs, he does so with his tools, which is to say, his books, his education and learning. For a similar sentiment, we need look no further than the poet Thomas Hakluyt, who in the Regiment of Princes describes his own turn to writing in very similar terms, possessing a, quote, back unbuxom, a back that doesn't bend in a way suited for manual labor. He chooses to write instead. Hakluyt, like Will, makes professional choices intimately tied to his physical embodiment. He also consciously describes this intellectual labor as indeed physical. And this is from quote 6. "A writer must three things to him knit, and in though may be no disseverance. Mind, yea, and hand, none may from other flit, but in him must be joint continuance. The minda all whole without invariance, on yea and hand await must always, and they to eke on him it is no nigh." There is much to comment on in that passage, but I just want to quickly note the knitting together of mind, eye, and hand. Implied with this, the hand must be grasping a writing implement, bringing together physical ability and the tools of one's trade. Rather than having limbs to work with, Will has lomas or tools. This substitution is almost indistinguishable between the two lines. And I would even argue that the book's products of scribal labor serve a prosthetic function for Will, supplementing and augmenting his ability. Mitchell and Snyder might refer to this as his, quote, capacity of incapacity, harnessing the creative abilities of his own body. What is perceived by various legal, social, and theological frameworks as inability becomes, therefore, ability. His intellectual labor, then, is inextricable from his non-normative embodiment. Mitchell and Snyder argue that bodies, quote, that disabled bodies, quote, provide alternative maps for living together in the deterritorialized yet highly regulated space of biopolitics. Further, such bodies can, quote, function as a disruptive force of resistance in sedimented systems of privilege accorded to normative bodies within nationalist imaginaries of ableism, end quote. Of course, Mitchell and Snyder are analyzing disability within our current neoliberal moment. But I would suggest that non-normative embodiment in the Middle Ages can be interrogated in some similar ways. Micah Goodrich, for example, explores what he calls biosalvation as it functions in the poem. By reading the C5 apology in such a manner, I am explicitly and self-consciously performing an act of cross-temporal identification, connecting my own present moment to that of Will and his own experience of his embodiment. As my title suggests, I am cripping Langland's will, That is to say, I am reading the character Will from a Crip theory perspective, but I'm also potentially cripping Langland's intentions. I am reading against the grain of the larger work, and yet I am also locating within Piers Plowman a fundamental tension between regimes of normalcy and non-normative embodiments. Excuse me. A fundamental tension between regimes of normalcy and non-normative embodiments, a tension enabled by a disabled will. To take Will seriously, then, that he is too long to work is to center disability, to make it inextricable from the social and salvific urgency in the poem. While Langland might not quite view disability as a disruptive force of resistance, as Mitchell and Snyder term it, or at least he might not view it in the positive terms they intend, Will's quest to discover moral perfection in search of the lives of do well, do bet, and do best continues to fail, to break off, to resist resolution. Moreover, I might take this one step further to suggest that the poem is itself animated by a Crip temporality. What are reason's questions to will, or the mandates in the statute of laborers, about other than the proper use of one's time? To use one's time improperly is to be a waster, a faker or deceiver, a member of the undeserving poor. This anxiety to make the best use of time hovers over the entire poem. But Langland notably appears unable to fashion a conclusion to his work. D. Van Smith describes the tendency of the poem to re-begin, to break off, to fail to conclude, as possessing an inceptive animus, that is, it continuously re-begins. Modifying that sentiment, I would argue that the workings of Langland's will operate in Crip time, a Crip animus. Ellen Samuels, in her essay, 6 Ways of Looking at Crip Time, describes how, and this is quote number 7, Crip time is broken time. It requires us to break in our bodies and minds to new rhythms, new patterns of thinking and feeling and moving through the world. It forces us to take breaks even when we don't want to, even when we want to keep going, to move ahead. It insists that we listen to our body minds so closely, so attentively, in a culture that tells us to divide the two and push the body away from us while also pushing it beyond its limits. Crip time means listening to the broken language of our bodies, translating them, honoring their words. End quote. Reason's wondering if will is broke or broken takes on a new resonance, I think, within Crip time. I would conclude today with the observation that the sections of Piers Plowman are labeled as passus, that is, steps, and that these steps in his journey might be undertaken by a figure who lawleth, glossed in the 9th passus as one who is, quote, lame or his leg out of joint. And I follow some of the work by Goodrich here on lolling and temporal suspension. We can also recall Hockley's regiment. Just a little before describing his reasoning for turning to scribal labor, the old man to whom the speaker converses says, and this is the final quote, "For he must rest a while. It is penance to me this long walk. It doth nuisance unto my crooked feeble limbs old, that been so stiff, hardly I may them fold." The old man refers to this long walk as penance. Excuse me. It is so difficult because his limbs do not fold or function properly. For him, his atypical physical progression is an aid to salvation. With this in mind, I would suggest that we can view the writing of Piers Plowman, its Crip progression, as yet another prosthetic substitution, this time for the long walk of penitence. Writing the poem becomes another of the lomas to labor with for the dreamer. Thank you.
That was so fabulous, Rick. I can't believe I get to follow you. And since there isn't an audible applause, I'll also just lend my verbal cheers. That was a fantastic talk. Thank you. I will also vamp while I pull up my slides, as one often has done in this era of online teaching. So thank you all for being here, and thank you to the organizers for planning this. If it might help you access my talk, I also have copies of the text and slide temporarily available online. There's a QR code on this slide, but you can also reach it through leahpopeparker.com/news/medieval Crip theory, the title of this webinar. And that's temporarily available. So if you want to go find my citations that might be of interest to some of you, they'll be there through tomorrow. So to begin, in her 2013 book, Feminist Queer Crip, as well as a 2021 essay called After Crip, Crip Afters, Alison Kafer invites us to desire Crip futures, to insist on Crip futures, futures for diverse bodies in our earthly society. However, in medieval Christianity, thinking futurity often sidestepped earthly society and secular medicine entirely to instead think through eschatology, theologies of last things, death, resurrection, apocalypse, and hopefully salvation. Today, I want to share with you a few examples from my research of how ideas about disability fueled medieval eschatology, and how in turn medieval eschatology was indeed a kind of Crip eschatology. We as medievalists have long recognized that medieval Christianity was very much a religion of the body. Footnote, Caroline Walker Bynum's entire career. We've been slower to acknowledge that in the Middle Ages as today, how we understand body is always already also how we understand disability. It's true, as Rick mentioned, that in the Middle Ages, there was no concept of disability as we have today, no singular term for it in any European language. And that's whether we think of disability as a term that describes a medicalizing way of describing bodies that look, feel, or function outside a statistically generated and enforced norm, or whether we think of disability as a unifying descriptor for a community that has asserted their human rights under the label of disability rights. But bodies were still bodies in the Middle Ages. Humans were still humans. There were still expectations for what bodies should be or do, to echo a phrase from Rosemary Garland Thompson, and many bodies resisted or subverted these expectations. In medieval texts, there are a great many examples of disability, either metaphorically or literally, getting roped into Christian eschatological conversations. Some are metaphorical references to disability concepts, as when the 9th century Old English translation of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy describes the unity of body and soul through the analogy of its body and limbs. Quote, "You can think the same thing about the body and about its limbs. If any of them is off, literally removed or missing, then it is no longer as completely a person as it previously was," end quote. My translation here of mon as person, meaning sort of a gender neutral human being, might overstate the extent to which personhood required an unimpaired body, but it gets the point across. Understanding completeness of personhood in terms of soul and body relied upon a more easily appreciated preference for a quote unquote complete physical body. Other uses of disability in spiritual rhetoric were more literal, as when Alfred of Einshem in his late 10th century Life of St. Swithin remarked that, quote, "We cannot write nor in words say all the miracles that this holy man Swithin has worked through God in this people's sight, either in imprisoned persons or in impaired persons, to make clear for these people that they themselves might earn God's kingdom with good deeds, just as Swithin did, who now shines through miracles." And there are numerous examples in that text of specific descriptions of different misliche untrim, variously misarranged people being healed. So Alfred affirms that the purpose of Swithin's miracles that he indicates were performed on literal bodies from the community around Winchester is to demonstrate the possibility of attaining God's kingdom, salvation. I expect many of you recognize with me the frequency with which healings illustrate the promise of salvation in medieval hagiography. It's a common trope that participates in vast networks of conceptual metaphors that shaped the way medieval Christians experienced and understood the world. To be healed is to be saved. To be impaired is to be damned. These are, in my view, some of many medieval eschatologies rooted in disability. And today I want to meditate more closely on the wounds of Christ, a very medieval thing to do, I think, and the role of the wounds of Christ in constructing a Crip eschatology. And then I'll return to a healing miracle performed by Christ himself in closing. These are additional ways in which medieval Christian eschatology relied upon Crip embodiments. And I'm claiming Crip for them here as bodies in conversation with disability, even if we're not sure that they should be called disabled. In this, I'm following scholars like Sammy Schock, Robert McBrewer, and Alison Kafer, again, who argues that claiming Crip can be a way of acknowledging that we all have bodies and minds with shifting abilities, and wrestling with the political meanings and histories of such shifts, end quote. Wrestling with the medieval European histories of those shifts, I argue, requires us to look for eschatological meanings of ability and disability of diverse body minds, what we might call Crip eschatologies. So the resurrected body of Christ served as a model for the imagined resurrected bodies of all humankind. And I acknowledge I'm glossing over a great deal of variance in early Christian eschatological development here. For time's sake, I want to acknowledge that it took a while for theologians to agree upon even having a corporeal resurrection. But once that was agreed upon, Christ's resurrection was already in place as a model for a more general resurrection for humankind. In the Gospel of John, though not in the Synoptic Gospels, Christ directs the disciples to view the evidence of his wounds as proof of his resurrection. The Apostle Thomas, doubting, says, quote, "Except I shall see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the place of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe," end quote. Thomas requires visible and tactile evidence to prove Christ's bodily continuity, that the same body that died has been resurrected. And by this evidence, Thomas is convinced. Quote, "Then he saith to Thomas, put in thy finger hither and see my hands, and bring hither thy hand and put it into my side, and be not faithless, but believing." Thomas answered and said to him, "My Lord and my God," end quote. Christ here recognizes, acknowledges, and validates Thomas's desire for corporeal evidence of the resurrection and continuity of the body. While the gospel text does not state whether Thomas actually touched Christ's wounds, medieval Christian iconography frequently assumed that he did, picturing Thomas prodding the wound in Christ's side, sometimes much more closely than this. For example, the benedictional of St. Athelwald, created at Winchester in the south of England around 973, selects the doubting of Thomas to illustrate Christ's resurrected body. In this image, Christ stands just right of center, raising his bare right arm, while a slightly kneeling Thomas extends a single long finger toward the wound in Christ's right side. Several other apostles look on, and the whole scene takes place in a Floriate architectural frame. As Robert Deschman observes, Peter's presence in the scene, standing among the apostles behind Thomas and holding his iconic key to heaven, links the doubting of Thomas to Judgment Day as a connection between Christ's resurrection, the resurrection of humankind, and the selection of those who will achieve salvation. The wounds are essential to believing that Christ indeed died and rose again, and therefore also to believing that all humankind would die and rise again. There is an interesting thing going on in this image in that Christ's hands and feet are not shown as wounded, even though he clearly has the wound in his side, but I'll pass that by for now, and I can say more about that later if anyone's interested. So the prioritization of this embodied proof in the gospel narrative reveals concerns that the resurrection of Christ cannot be true unless the body that appears before the apostles is the same body of Christ who died on the cross. It has to be a resurrection, not a reincarnation. As Candida Moss notes, quote, "Jesus's wounds are an integral part of his identity. It is by his wounds that he is recognized as Jesus himself," end quote. Christ's wounds serve a rhetorical purpose as markers of identity, and in his case, also markers of divinity. Unless Christ is wounded and remains wounded in the resurrection, there's no hope of Christian salvation. But Christ's wounds are not disabling. Although wounds may produce disabling impairments, such as amputation of a limb or a chronic condition requiring ongoing treatment, the resurrected Christ shows no signs of experiencing pain or impaired bodily function due to these persistent wounds. Indeed, Christ's wounds become positive signifiers of the redemption in Christian visual and theological traditions, such as the benediction of St. Athelwold. However, his wounds link him conceptually to the twinned eschatological specters of disability and damnation, as the 10th century Old English poem Christ in Judgment illustrates. Christ in Judgment, which for a long time has also been called Christ 3, is a nearly 800-line poem that survives early in the Exeter book, the largest surviving collection of Old English poetry. The picture I'm showing you here is not of Christ in Judgment, but of the much more visually interesting current front of the manuscript, beginning partly into Christ 1, which is also called Lyrics for Advent. It shows signs of having been used as a cutting board, as well as a large circular stain, possibly from a blue pot. Christ in Judgment, a few leaves later, describes the ecological disaster of the apocalypse, the resurrection of all humankind, and their division into the blessed and the damned in the last judgment, which includes an extensive speech from Christ that praises the blessed, but mostly castigates the damned for their sins. My favorite line from this extended guilt trip of a speech is, "I drew you out of hell, provided that you would thereafter keep yourself out of hell." Throughout, both the narrative voice and the ventriloquized Christ pay extensive attention to Christ's wounds, often in conversation with the metaphorical and literal markings of sin on the damned. And I can't give you every example of the damned as being marked with sin, but phrases such as wounded with sins, marked by stains of sins or crimes, they're throughout the poem. So the poem describes the arrival of the wonderful sight of Christ, countenance of the noble king, underscoring both his visibility with on scene, which suggests both appearance and something to be seen, and his physicality, his vita. But as the poem unfolds, it becomes clear that what is visible about Christ, that is wonderful, wunderlich, includes the signs of his crucifixion, perhaps even punning on the inclusion of wound in wunderlich. When Christ's body appears to the resurrected masses of humankind in this poem, his body takes on divergent meanings. Christ appears, quote, bitter to the baleful, wondrously beautiful, unalike to the blessed and the wretched, end quote. His body is made hyper-visual, with many later descriptions emphasizing the injury done to his body. The narrative foregrounds the puncture of Christ's hands and feet, the wound in his side, and the crown of thorns. Christ himself says, "See now the mortal wounds on my palms and on my feet, from which you once benefited as redemption, by which I hung firmly fastened. Again, you may also see here the bloody wound manifest now on my side," end quote. Putting this section in the first person of Christ's voice personalizes the exchange as an oral and visual relationship between the human bodies told to see, Yeseoth, Christ's wounds, and the speaking embodied Christ gesturing to wounds on his own body. This relationship is further mapped out throughout the poem in the use of words for wounds and semantically related terms like scars, marks, and stains upon the body to bridge between the appearance of Christ and the sins of the damned. And again, I'll say this slide is in that Access Copies link if you wanted to check it out in more detail. While some of the Old English terms that describe wounded or marked bodies in Christ in Judgment are clearly associated with either the blessed or the damned, the word wound applies remarkably evenly to both the damned and Christ himself. This table summarizes token, meaning a sign or token, is seemingly neutrally coded, evenly applying to Christ, the blessed, and the damned, and even to the apocalypse itself as a portent, a fortakna. More curiously, thach, which means a mark or a stain, and normally has both positively and negatively coded uses elsewhere in Old English. It's used in both senses in Beowulf frequently, for example. It's exclusively negative in Christ in Judgment. Only the damned are stained. Similarly, wom for stain or blemish is only ever used to describe Christ or the blessed in negative forms like womleus, as in stainless. But Christ and the damned have their wounds and the word wound in common. While Christ's wounds are clearly understood as literal, they also symbolize the way Christ's sacrifice is taken as an exchange on behalf of humankind, redeeming their sins for wounds, despite having no sins of his own. So while it does not make sense to call Christ disabled, there is quite a lot to be gained from recognizing his embodiment as Crip, as participating in the mutability and vulnerability of the human body, not just as a side effect of his incarnation in a human body, but as a central feature of the incarnation, making possible redemption, making possible salvation. Claiming Cripness for Christ means recognizing the Cripness of medieval salvation history and the Cripness of medieval eschatological hope. Even without terms for disability or this modern theorization of Crip, I would posit that medieval theologians still knew how central Cripness was to their eschatology. Disability pervades Old English homiletic texts, which is why I'm planning to explore that corpus more fully in my second book project. The second homily in the Blickling Codex, for example, which is a 10th century homiliary now at Princeton. Blickling Homily 2 recounts the gospel story of Christ healing. He's typically called the man born blind, who is employed by begging. The man asks for mercy, and when Christ asks what he would have from him, the man says, "Lord, that I may see." Christ grants his request, saying, "Look now, your eyes have been healed by your own faith." He immediately and at once saw, and then soon after was following the Lord and praised him and worshiped him. End quote. This short miracle narrative betokens the promise of the resurrection and the afterlife, as the homily later explains. Quote, "All of humankind was in blindness and forsook the brightness of that heavenly light and suffered this world's darkness and wretchedness. The Lord then, through his arrival, illuminated this world and affixed all believers for their journey to the way of life, that they might, through the desire of their mind with good deeds, earn the light of the everlasting life." The Leah thus Legion. Sorry, next slide there. The Leah thus Lephus. This biblical story, as a typological analogy for the redemption, aligns blindness with fallenness. And yet the homilist also holds up the blind man as a model for the congregation. He says, "Dearest men, let us imitate the blind man who in body was healed and also in mind. Neither let us ask our Lord for this transitory wealth, nor these earthly goods which speedily from man depart. But let us ask the Lord for the light that never ends." End quote. The healed blind man is lauded as an example of Christian faith. So in this story, the stakes are eternal, and the light of physical sight is used to explain the promise of salvation. The homilist knows that that is what this physicality is being used to convey. The prominent role of disability for promoting eschatological hope in these and many other Old English texts leads me to assert that at least in early medieval England, though I suspect it was true elsewhere and elsewhen in medieval Europe, Christian eschatology was Crip eschatology. I want to say that an eschatology so dependent upon Crip bodies cannot escape being a Crip future, a promise of a future for Crip that I desire with Alison Kafer. But to do so would be to ignore the strong undercurrent of eschatological eugenic logic that has from the beginnings of Christianity been intertwined with this dependence upon disability. Though I've not mentioned them, I imagine many of us are familiar with promises that the resurrected body would be a whole body, a healed body. Healing miracles manifest this promise on earth. So when we defend the Middle Ages from popular assumptions of, quote, dread and despair, which is indeed how one 1993 essay about pre-modern disability summed up the situation in its title, we should not gloss over observable realities. Resurrection largely promised the erasure of disability, but to make that promise, Christian eschatology did actually foreground disability in discourse about resurrection and salvation. Recognizing these Crip eschatologies of the Middle Ages challenges us to foreground disability in our scholarship on the Middle Ages, to think through disability as our medieval sources did, so that we can forge our own future for Crip. Thank you.
I guess I'm up. Thank you for that, Parker. It's going to be hard to follow two really wonderful papers, but I'm hoping that I will have some things to say that will connect with a lot of what they have said as well. I just want to thank the organizers for putting this together and for those of you who are here. So my work today is actually part of a chapter in progress for the forthcoming Routledge Companion to Global Chaucer. So I welcome any suggestions or comments as I continue to work on this. Today, I'd like to offer a reading of The Pardoner's Tale with attention to the disruptive Crip time produced by its setting during the Black Plague. The anti-normative potential of the tale, as I will show, reveals one way in which the lens of disability can not only expand past representations of disability, but also use the medieval to help us better understand how disability is viewed and used in a post-COVID-19 onset world. Recently, critical attention has turned to the ways in which medieval disability studies not only embodies, but also produces thought-provoking questions about Crip time, which both Parker and Rick have already mentioned. Crip time, which features or shares features with queer time, denotes how the experience of time can be different from those with disabled and or chronically ill body minds. It is a reimagining of linear time that takes into account the time disruption and even disorientation of illness and disability. Not only might people with disabilities take more time to complete some tasks, but they may even experience time in drastically different ways. People with disabling chronic illnesses, moreover, exist in a liminal time span, quote, never to reach the end point of health, end quote, as Alicia Spencer Hall affirms. Though many readers have commented on the medical aspects of the Partner's Tale, aside from my fellow panelist, Rick Godden's illuminating study of the partner and his old man, these aspects have not been examined through the lens of disability. And I just want to take a moment to note my indebtedness to Rick's article for helping me think through these ideas. And it's absolutely wonderful that I get to do that with him here. That doesn't happen often. So thank you, Rick. The partner's body, or perhaps more accurately, bodies, has long been a subject of intense critical inquiry, the language of which shares many discursive features with disability. The narrator describes the partner as having stringy yellow hair, the voice of a goat, and the inability to grow a beard. And the absence of facial hair in particular causes the narrator to speculate on the partner's gender, sexuality, and physical wholeness. The partner is a queer figure that troubles any stable notion of heteronormativity, and I would also suggest ability. I do not wish to diagnose the partner, but I do contend that he is a queer Crip figure whose excessive and incomplete body refuses to be controlled or limited. As Godden has noted, the partner's body resists legibility, which allows for anti-normative potential, a potential similarly reflected in the body of the tale's old man. These two bodies are emblematic of Crip time, able to touch one another through narrative and to reach out to readers both past and present. The mysterious old man stands before the rioters as a figure of both old age and physical disability. Like the partner, the old man resists definition, and scholars have associated him with various identities and symbolic meanings. It is perhaps most accurate to state simply that the old man is multivalent, and that his instability, indeed his liminality, invites a Crip reading that analyzes his physical and temporal uncertainty. Physically, the old man is infirm. His body, he tells the rioters, is wasting away, and he walks with a staff that he knocks upon the ground, beseeching Mother Earth to provide him rest in death. We are not told what has rendered the old man infirm, however. The cause simply could be his advanced age, demonstrating the temporary nature of ability and the certainty of disability for all bodies that live long enough to experience it. It is also possible, as Peter Beadler has posited, that the man is the lone survivor of the plague in his village, and that the rioters have encountered him as he is wandering away from his former home. Although we cannot be sure how the old man has become disabled, we can highlight the features his condition shares with disability and chronic illness. It's difficult to provide a singular definition for chronic illness that encapsulates its varied characteristics, symptoms, causes, and experiences. So I will share this one also from Alicia Spencer Hall. Quote, broadly speaking, a chronic illness is persistent and incurable, but not terminal. As he wanders, searching for someone to trade their youth for his old age, the old man describes his condition as persistent and incurable. He has been walking for an undetermined amount of time, experiencing a continual loss of flesh, blood, and skin, and longing for rest in death, which will not come for him. The chronicity of the old man's condition positions him as a disabled man living in Crip time, a time that has no known ending and no destination. Seemingly contradictory elements of time exist simultaneously for the old man: life and death, youth and age, past, present, and future. The chronically ill, Spencer Hall tells us, exist in what she calls the duration, always waiting for health. Similarly, the old man, both physically and temporally, lives in the in-between, or the duration. The narrative of the partner's tale quickly moves away from the old man, leaving him to continue on his search for cure through death. The old man is like Chaucer's pilgrims, on a journey in the in-between, the end of which is forever deferred. They never do make it to St. Thomas's shrine, the location of which was home to numerous miraculous cures. As Chaucer explains, the pilgrims are heading to Canterbury in order to express thanks for help received while that they were seca. But it is unclear whether any of Chaucer's disabled pilgrims, such as Alison of Bath or the partner, are looking for healing upon arrival. As a result, as Godden has noted, they, quote, bear the spectral traces of miraculous healing yet to occur, end quote. In addition to bearing the specter of a healed or cured future, it might be useful to note that, like the partner, all of the pilgrims bear the specter of an ill or disabled past. After the partner tells his tale and attempts to dupe the other pilgrims with the tricks he has just confessed to, the host famously threatens to cut off the partner's testicles and enshrine them in pig dung. This insult draws attention to the Crip time presented by the partner's own disabled body. The host threatens to amputate that which has already been or has possibly been amputated. Past and present amputations evoke the promise of a future restoration never to be fulfilled. The old man's yet to occur future is similarly haunted by his unknown past, as his existence in the duration, after experiencing plague and or an illness of some kind, resembles that of the folks on pilgrimage to Canterbury. Setting the partner's tale during plague time heightens the collapse between past, present, and future. Just as it is today, in the Middle Ages, it was not uncommon to see epidemic diseases framed as specific instances or moments in time. And people had a sense of what life was like before, during, and after the arrival of such diseases. The COVID-19 pandemic is no different, as time is explicit in its very name, the 19 indicating the beginning point of the spread of the disease in 2019. Readers approaching Chaucer after 2019 thus will have lived through a time of pestilence, most likely having contracted the disease themselves or knowing someone who has. It is not an exaggeration to state that no Chaucerian reader post-2019 will come to his work without having their lives affected by COVID-19 in some way. The temporal change in life after the onset of the pandemic cannot be overstated, as the disabling effects of illness necessarily affect the normative organization of daily life. A normative schedule can be inaccessible for the chronically ill or disabled. Their body minds simply cannot bend to the clock, to borrow a phrase from Alison Kafer. After the onset of COVID-19, days and weeks have seemed for some, and certainly for myself, to bleed into one another. Today, it is not uncommon to hear friends or acquaintances cheekily referred to the before times when discussing the order of pre-pandemic life. And hashtags such as #pandemic_time have become commonplace on social media sites such as Twitter. Recent studies have attempted to chart this widespread sense of time distortion. Barrett Brogard notes that the loss of a normative schedule is partly to blame. And one factor that is having an impact on our lives is having an impact on our collective sense of normative time is what Carla Manley has called the purgatory effect, or the sense of waiting for life to resume to its pre-pandemic status. As the current pandemic has progressed, increments of time within it have heightened this sense of distortion and have created senses of time that occur simultaneously, but are experienced differently. We can see a model for this in the rioters' reaction to the threat of death in contrast to that of the old man. While the young men fear and attempt to avoid a death that has tended to strike the younger population, the old man welcomes and even seeks out death to no avail. Complicating this matter in today's pandemic context is the sheer unpredictability of the COVID-19 virus itself. Some of those for whom COVID-19 is not fatal may only have the disease for a short period of time, whereas others may develop long COVID, a chronic condition caused by the COVID-19 infection that causes a range of physical and psychological symptoms. These so-called long haulers are thrust into a Crip time with no foreseeable end. While some at the time of this talk refer to the pandemic as over, others, particularly the chronically ill and the disabled, continue to conduct their lives similar to that of the beginning of the pandemic timeline. Moreover, folks who are heading back into offices and resuming work schedules may reconstruct a somewhat normative time schedule, while others, such as those who have shifted to remote work, will produce a new sense of time, one that may be anti-normative, forcing the clock to bend to the body. These different timelines, all born out of pandemic time, exist simultaneously. Effectively, COVID-19 has placed us in the duration, never to return fully to the before times. However, I would like to suggest that these cross-temporal connections provide an opportunity for learning that can reshape our collective understanding of time and how different bodies experience it, while also revealing the promise that the construction of new kinds of time brings and the new ways of being in time that come along with it. This moment ultimately calls us to use the experiences of the medieval past to imagine the future in new ways. In a concrete example, Monica Green's groundbreaking work from 2014 on the origins of the bubonic plague explains that attending to the medieval response to the disease can help shape modern day ideas and experience. Thus, she advocates for, quote, a global approach to the disease's history, thinking across time and space, end quote. And indeed, her work has been used and continues to be used as a way to talk about COVID-19 as well. The act of thinking across time and space is necessarily Crip. As Ellen Samuels provocatively asserts, Crip time is time travel. Acknowledging the potentially liberatory but also alienating aspects of living in Crip time, she explains, quote, "Disability and illness have the power to extract us from linear progressive time with its normative life stages and cast us into a wormhole of backward and forward acceleration, jerky stops and starts, tedious intervals, and abrupt endings," end quote. This notion of time travel takes me back to the old man, his withered body perpetually moving, embodying youth and age, and journeying both away from and towards a forever deferred future. I think too of Chaucer's pilgrims, who are also moving toward an end that will never be realized. And lastly, I think of the pardoner. The presumed mutilation and restoration of his body continues to resurface, even as he attempts to trick his audience into planning for future death and disability by buying his ineffective pardons that promise salvation that may never come. These figures are all time travelers, able to traverse across Chaucer's text, transmitting their medieval Crippistemologies into the present, and shaping and being shaped by readers who have been affected by and or are still living in pandemic time, and who are learning what the experience of disability and illness throughout history can teach us about our own embodiments of difference. Thank you.
Oh, that was so good. Thank you all so much. So we have about 30 minutes for questions, which is wonderful. And now, as people think of questions, because I know I'll get my questions in about 3 days, because it was so rich. But I want to start truly by thanking you, because the amount of work that you put into not just your analysis, but in figuring out a way to introducing us to such a rich theoretical framework to help us understand your analysis, right? Like, so much work into that, and I'm kind of really blown away by that. So I want to start by thanking you sincerely for taking your time to and take us towards your analysis. I'm truly thankful, and so I'm hopefully people raise your hands, ask questions. Again, someone says, thank you for a wonderful set of talks. I learned so much. So lots of thank yous. Any questions? Okay, then there's a Q and there's a question. Let me find it. So Catherine Bloomer asks if you could the panelists address the intersection of disability as metaphor?
I have thoughts about that, but you're also welcome, either of you, to start or follow. I'll start. Yes, we can address the intersection of disability as metaphor in probably a set of different ways. That's something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, because in the theologically inflected literature that I tend to focus on, it's hard to tell sometimes when disability is quote unquote just a metaphor, or if it is something that reflects a real historical person's lived experience of their body. And what I have settled on for a lot of contexts, for example, whether or not the person who is described as going to visit a saint's shrine and is described as with some mysterious term like they were unwell, but they might have a specific symptom or experience described. They might be described as blind. They might be described as using a cane to walk. So we don't know usually if there is an actual historical person that is being described there. For each different text, we have to decide whether we think that there is a basis in that reality. And a lot of the time, I do think there was, even if not for that specific example that the hagiographer is writing about. It's an experience that happened, even if it's not being accurately or specifically described. I think it's still metaphorical in the way that it gets used rhetorically in hagiographical context to say this is what this body stands in for, usually not in positive ways for the impaired or disabled person. But then there are also ways in which, because disability gets used metaphorically, it actually becomes so integral to Christian theology that it's foregrounded way more than we tend to think. One of the things, I'm pretty sure this is in David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder's very foundational 2000 book, Narrative Prosthesis, is the idea that once you start noticing how much narrative tends to depend on disability, it is astonishing that disability has actually not been hidden. It has been brought to the fore throughout literary history. And I think that's true in theology as well, that we modern thinkers about the Middle Ages often would expect what we identify as a marginalized community or identity or embodiment to be hidden away. But in fact, it was quite foregrounded. It was quite integral to the way people thought about theology. And particularly what I've been thinking about is the way disability metaphors were integral to thinking about eschatology. Does it matter if it's metaphorical or real? I'm not sure, because a metaphor is always going to impact the way a person lives in their own embodiment. If the way your body works is used as a metaphor to explain sin and salvation, then that's probably shaping the way you live your day-to-day life. More often than not, we don't have written records from those people to tell us whether that actually meant or what that actually meant for them. But I'm inclined to see even metaphors rather than literal depictions of disability as one of the few ways we have of accessing those very ordinary medieval people who didn't get to read or write anything about their experiences. Those metaphors show us something about what they lived and experienced. So that's my very long-winded answer about metaphors, but Tory or Rick may want to say more.
Just have something very brief to add to that, and that is, I think that metaphors also show us a lot about the anxieties, at least, social anxieties of medieval people who maybe did not see themselves as disabled, and it showed, their thinking about the disabled mind or the disabled body as well. So I think that metaphors can tell us not just about those lived experiences of the disabled, but also maybe, what an able-bodied society thought of people with disabilities.
And I would just add that a lot of times those metaphors also represent certain kinds of ableist violence, both direct and kind of conceptual, that produces disability. But it's kind of funny that this question comes up because I'm teaching a graduate seminar on disability theory, and we were reading Kindred for last class just last night and discussing the character of Dana, for those of you that know Kindred, and we were reading Sammy Schock's really great work from Body Minds, and there Schock makes the point that we need to read the figure of Dana in Kindred, her disability, as both material and metaphor. And to read it as just one or the other is to miss quite a bit of institutions of slavery and discursive constructions of ability, disability, and race. And I think I started out a little bit leaning hard on the kind of material aspect of disability in response to some of Mitchell and Snyder's critiques, but I'm certainly becoming more and more convinced that we need to consider both, and to obviously only consider the metaphorical is to reduce the disabled individual to just a prop, just a figure, but to ignore it is also to diminish. Much more to say, but that's just an opening thought.
Thank you so much. We have a second question from Una Credon-Carey. Thank you for these wonderful talks. I was wondering if Dr. Pearman would be interested in mediating on the role of the pardoner's relics in this sort of chronic timeline.
Yeah, I think I can say something about that. That's a really good question. Because the relic, as we know, relics just in general are supposed to give this promise of healing or cure. So the question sort of becomes, if the pardoner is presenting false relics, they are not real relics, they're sheep's bones or, whatever he's been able to collect along the way, then is that future promise that he's presenting with them, then is it just continuously deferred? Are they not going to be able to access that healed or cured future because the relic in and of itself isn't real? So I think it's an excellent question and certainly plays into kind of the way that the text crosses over in terms of future, present, and past all together, because the relic as well is it's symbolic of a supposed past where you may have had a saint who endured some kind of disabling or very visible kind of wounding to sort of demonstrate their sanctity, their ability, to have a relic that can cause these miraculous cures as well. So the past is coming into play as well. I don't know if that answers the question, but I think it definitely fits in with the way that the text, I think, brings together all of these timelines.
If I could jump in just for a moment, just 'cause I've been thinking about this issue also, because I'm turning some of my work on the pardoner into a chapter in my book and thinking about the prosthetic objects, and just wanted to note that the relic, there's really quite a thick temporality, isn't there, to the relic? It's that object from the past, and yet it's also kind of undead. It's inert but also active, and so it's present and past. It's vibrant and yet dead, and it's traveling. So it's really traversing, I think, many and multiple temporalities there as it comes into contact with individual people. Half a thought. I don't know if that makes sense.
Una says, thank you so much, and this is fascinating. We do have another question. Okay. Oh, they're coming in. Okay, from Kara Frasca, is there any intersection between Crip and madness theories with the discussion of disability as a metaphor and connections to religion? I was wondering how Christian mystics like Marjorie Kemp ability to attain enlightenment also disabled them in everyday life with seizures, intrusive visions, etc. Apologies if the question is unclear. The next question, I'll just read them all and then we can decide how to go about them. Thanks so much for this convo. This is from Jonathan Shrew. Crip politics today usually aim for radical collective social transformation. Where might we see liberatory potentials in Crip medieval contexts? And finally, from Eric McDougall, Dr. Parker somewhat mentioned the erasure of Christ's wounds on his hands and feet from the nails of the crucifixion. The wound in the side remains, but the wounds that would be most disabling are gone. Is that representation just in the shown Benedictorial of Saint Ethelwold, or representative of something broader?
I can answer that last question first, because I think it'll be just me, and then the others are more for all of us to think about and discuss together. So thank you for picking up on that breadcrumb I laid in there. So I have not done a comprehensive survey of other images of either Doubting Thomas scenes or Christ when he's just been resurrected. There are a great many images of Christ during at the Last Judgment, Christ in Majesty, various other depictions where Christ does have the wounds on his hands and feet. I want to find a good selection of specifically early medieval English examples before I have a comprehensive answer to that. And so I don't know the answer to that, but I can tell you that in this particular manuscript, the Benedictional of St. Athelwold, there are other interesting things going on with the erasure or non-erasure of wounds. So the one that I have the most thoughts about is the depiction not too much later of St. Athelfrith, who's an early medieval English native saint, twice married virgin, founder of the monastery at Ely, and various other things. Bede describes her dying from a tumor that she develops on her neck. She says herself, according to Bede, that the tumor is representative of her sins, that she as a princess loved to wear these beautiful necklaces, and now she is suffering for it because this is her penitence. So a physician lances the tumor and she dies. She's identified as saintly later because she's dug up after 16 years, and either the wound is healed and there's a scar, or the wound is healed and there is no scar. And that varies between Latin and Old English versions of the story. The Benedictional of St. Athelwald does a very interesting middle ground position where there is a line on that saint's neck that it looks in some reproductions slightly darker, but it's a deeper line in the pigment, not a different color. And so what I think this manuscript might be doing, and it's a side project that I need to figure out more fully, is hedging its bets on whether saintly or divine bodies, like Christ and his saints, maintain their wounds or marks of their wounds in their perfected resurrection afterlife bodies. So the theology behind this, going back to Augustine, is that saints will have the marks of their wounds, but it will be re-encoded as a sign of glory. But there are very clear dissenting voices in that tradition saying, we're not sure if we like the idea of there being disabled bodies in the afterlife, not putting it in those terms exactly, but expressing some concern about that, as with the erasure of Athelthryth's scar. And so I think the Benedictional of St. Athelwald might be doing kind of a middle ground thing where the wounds that need to be there are there. Christ has a wound in his side so that Thomas can poke it, but he doesn't need to have wounds in his hands and his feet for Thomas to show that he's doubting. And so those are not represented. That's my preliminary theory, but thank you for asking about that, because talking through it got me thinking in some more directions I might go. So thank you.
Tory, Richard, Leah, we have 2 other questions. I'll repeat them again.
No, I can maybe start to talk through the first question about Crip and madness theories, and with the help of Parker and Rick to bring in some more information as well. But especially in the case of someone like Marjorie Kemp, we definitely see mental illness as not just a mental experience, but a fully embodied experience. And indeed, ideas about madness or mental illness were very bodily in a lot of ways, with the brain, and often connected to the female body. So the brain being conceived as or thought of as a womb that can conceive thought. And so the mad brain is sort of confused with a faulty womb in a certain respect. And so in a lot of ways, the bodies of the mentally ill were then associated with femininity, or they were feminized, or if they were male bodies, emasculated in some way. So with Kemp, we see her, express and experience her spirituality through her body. This allows her to have this, close connection to Christ, but at the same time, it causes everyone around her, to kind of turn against her. She definitely experiences disabling effects because of her behavior. So it's it's that sort of fraught idea where disability can be seen as something that's both really positive. This is a demonstration of her spirituality, of her close connection to Christ on one hand. On the other hand, she's ostracized in her community, and not just there, when she travels, she's also ostracized by others as well. But then in a sense, that ostracization allows her to experience the same kind of suffering that Christ has suffered, which again enhances her spirituality. So it's all very much entangled together. That is very long-winded, and I don't know. What do you think, Parker and Rick? What would you add to this conversation?
not sure if I have too much to add at the moment, because I think that was a really good start. The word that I would kind of pick up on is entangled. Just thinking about how these various states of being and embodiment of body minds are entangled, and how madness can be both a gift and punishment, as well as just simply material experience. And I'm even thinking of figures like Chrétien Zavain, who, you know, goes mad and goes to the forest, and yet it's his experiences there that lets him have some kind of restoration. So in some ways it's a punishment because he breaks his word to his wife, but it's also, and this is part of a larger argument, but it also, he needs that in order to attain some kind of restorative at the end. And with Marjorie, it's that similar, I think, entanglement of both the negative and the positive of the punishment and the ecstatic in that sense.
Yeah, I would add that I think we've all dropped the word body mind, one word all squished together, no space, but I don't know if any of us explained what we mean by it. And so perhaps that's a helpful reference point to note that I think for medieval studies, whenever we're talking about the body and the mind, we're always talking about them together, because we are we're trying to reimagine a conceptualization of embodiment and cognition that's pre-Cartesian, but before this famous split where we started deciding they were separate things. And I, like Rick, am teaching a grad seminar on disability theory right now, and we've had a lot of conversations about why don't we talk about the mind more in disability studies? And I've been thinking about what that means for how we do that in medieval disability studies. And I think one of the assertions we need to make is that whenever we say body or mind, we kind of are always saying body mind, meaning both together, because in a pre-Cartesian medieval world, that's what it was. That was understood. The body and mind were understood as entangled in that way. And I like that word entanglement for it. And so I'm not sure that Crip theory and madness theory or mad studies are even that separate when we think about them in a medieval context, or nor should they be. Yeah.
Right. I agree. I think more importantly, they should be. You know, they already intersect. And so maybe this is a place where we can continue to bring them together, to tangle them, right?
For Jonathan's question about, you know, crip politics today, and if there's any, where might we see kind of radical collective social transformation, something liberatory in crip medieval context? It's such a fantastic question, and I'm still trying to find my way to any kind of response. And I guess I might, for the moment, just really focus on potential, you know, potentiality. I'm not sure that I'm seeing it. And I think something in the lack of resolution in Langland's Piers Plowman, and the failure to get to Canterbury and the Canterbury Tales, that there is this kind of normative promise of closure that hangs over the text, and yet they never quite reach there, and in the process lean on interdependence and kind of radical forms of community, and yet it always seems like that's going to dissolve as soon as like the proper end is reached for those texts. And so I don't know, I guess I'm not sure if we can find it except as a potentiality, but I would really love a better answer than mine to that.
My response, at least my first thought when I read this question, was in the frustration of the narrative drive to closure, which is essentially, you know, what you're saying is that there are so many medieval texts that don't have that easy, clear resolution at the end. And I find that to be liberatory in a lot of ways as a reader. And I think medieval readers did too. I mean, if we think about the Canterbury Tales, you know, all of the different sort of spurious editions that people wrote, and they kind of tried to continue the story in certain ways. Readers were wanting to see it come to an end as well, and that led to the creation of new narratives. So yeah, I think that's where I see it a lot, is in that the end of a lot of medieval texts aren't really endings. I think of like Arthur, right? And how King Arthur, we're never sure whether he's alive, dead, if he's going to return. And so kind of all of those possibilities exist at once.
I agree that if we're going to look for liberatory possibilities, they're in the shadows, the corners of these texts. It's things like that end of the first sentence of the Canterbury Tales, that all of these pilgrims are going to see Thomas Becket because he helped them when they were sick. And that's just normal there, that, yeah, people get sick, and they may determine their healing, their recovery, whatever they want to call it, as a saint's intervention, a saint's advocacy on their behalf. That's a different religious and cultural context than some, not all, people living today. But it's completely, it's made normal to make major ventures in your life based on how you have experienced your body in a way that, at least at the time, was not what we would call normative, probably. I think we also find liberatory potential in the shadows of original sin, actually, in that if we have these larger metaphors that sin is manifested as impairment or disability or bodily marking in some kind of a way, then when you have theologies that say that all humans have that, well, then that normativizes the idea that all humans would have infinitely diverse and or marked bodies. I don't want to push too hard on that and say that it's a very pro bodily diversity kind of a worldview, but it is a worldview that at least says you shouldn't be trying to have a perfect unmarked body on earth. The follow-up is because you'll get it in the resurrection and the afterlife. But at least for earthly society, it takes away some of that normative pressure in what I think might have been a very positive way for matters of providing care. And so another one of those shadows that has liberatory potential in it is to look for the carers, look for all of the people in the hagiographic texts that are described as engaged in care work as a recognized just part of life. Care work is one of the aspects of disability that is hidden in modern life, in mainstream media, et cetera. And so the fact that it's yet another thing that was not hidden so much in, maybe I shouldn't be saying it's in the shadows of the text, because maybe that part isn't. So the liberatory potential is not, it doesn't make me feel great, but it makes me feel a little bit hopeful, if I can tie it up like that.
Can I just add one thing? So listening to your talks, I wrote down a lot of notes, and for example, Leah, someone said the forcing the clock to bend to the body, and I think that was Tory, and Leah said disability as a community that asks for rights, and with Richard, you said that it's disability as the inability to labor significantly for the needs of capital. And what I wrote in my notes is that the point is a refusal to conform to the conditions of labor set by outside forces. And when I think about it that way, it makes me think of Cristina Mirabilis, who refused. She refused to conform to those conditions, and she brought her community together. And actually, Ana Castillo, who is a Chicana writer, she uses Cristina Mirabilis to create the character of La Loca, who combines Cristina Mirabilis with New Mexican and Chicana characters to say, help her community. And in my mind creates a system of Latinx solidarity through these a character like La Loca. And so thinking of Jonathan's question, for me, that's where I'm taken immediately. Someone like Cristina Mirabilis, who refuses to conform and who brings the community together. And so right, we don't often talk of Cristina Mirabilis, and so we don't know her story in the same way. So anyway, I just wanted to add that because, that's what came to me after hearing all your amazing papers. Do we have any other questions? Oh, it's 2:30. Any final comment before we go? No, it's 2:30 for me in Mountain Time.
3:30 here.
Okay,
Same.
4:30.
Well, since Tory's almost done with her workday.
What is time?
I would just say thank you again to all the attendees, and thank you for your exciting questions and engaging ideas. Thank you again to Tory and Rick. It's been a pleasure, as always, chatting with you about these topics.
Thank you all. It's
Yes,
been great.
thank you.
Thank you, everyone.